Jerry Saltz is likely the most prominent contemporary art critic in the United States. As might be expected of someone occupying that position, Saltz is widely known for his social media posts, perhaps more so than for his articles or other long-form works. His presence on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook are largely why he's the only living art critic that I could imagine a random person even possibly knowing the name of. In recent years, Saltz has, through his posting, fixated on the spectacle of American politics and specifically on the figure of Donald Trump. A lot of his social media posts and even a lot of his actual art writing are tinged by this pathological relationship to Trump. This ranges from sharing and analyzing artworks depicting Trump to explicitly commenting on art in the context of recent political events to subtle choices of language and topic. There are examples of this in nearly every recent article of his, but I want to focus on one particular example which illustrates a trend in Saltz's thinking and in turn describes a broader movement in contemporary art. In an article published in November 2020, Saltz describes this recent piece of public art, a sculpture memorializing Mary Wollstonecraft, as kitsch, and I think that's a completely fair assessment, but he concludes by claiming that the real answer for why most public sculpture is bad and why this keeps happening with art, much architecture, and too many governments is bureaucracy and populism and the rule of the common denominator, a need to not offend, to please, to be liked, at least by the people making the choice, to be popular and to not change. It defaults to the, quote, traditional values, unquote, of whatever white hegemony dominated that culture 150 years ago, at the apex of American and European colonialism. When it comes to public sculpture, this usually means hackneyed figurative art that claims to signify or represent an idea or person, but really only represents lazy and regressive ideas, unquote. I feel there are a number of issues with Jerry's evaluation of the societal ills that have brought this sculpture about. To begin, the idea that Britain or any other country whose artistic output Saltz is writing about is subject to the, quote, rule of the common denominator is at best an oversimplification. There are so many ways in which any sort of genuine populism or democratic rule is impeded. The topic reaches far beyond the scope of this video. This is a bit beside the point though, because I'm more interested in Jerry's apparent suggestion that public art shouldn't be populist at all. Given that public art is public, that seems like an odd position. There are plenty of approaches that one could take to public art, and more than that, there are plenty of approaches just to making a piece of public art to honor the life of Mary Wollstonecraft. I bet lots of them could even manage to please most of the British public and Jerry Saltz. If any of them are to be successful as public art, though, I imagine that they would begin with the goal of being for the public and thus populist in some respect. To be clear, I don't personally like it much either, but I'm not the British public and neither is Jerry Saltz. Were I to make an argument about the quality of the sculpture as a work of public art, I think I would be obligated to ask about what it does for the public and not just whether it appeals to my specific taste. Most of all, it's wrong for Jerry to argue all of this while identifying kitschiness as the issue with Maggie Hambling's sculpture. In my video on the Ashcan School, I gave a longer description of the avant-garde and kitsch dichotomy as it was presented in 1939 by Clement Greenberg, and has been generally understood since. For posterity, I'll summarize it again here. In Greenberg's view, kitsch is thought of as the product of urbanization and industrialization under capitalism, which creates a new working class, the proletariat, who desire a formal culture but whose economic precarity discourages them from engaging with difficult and time-consuming art, in other words, the avant-garde. So kitsch is an alternative, mass-produced and artificial culture made to placate them. While it may be descriptively true that right now kitsch has more mass appeal and is in that sense populist, it must be understood that kitsch, and thus Jerry's issue with the sculpture, results from a social order overseen by the capitalist class. Kitsch is an inorganic culture imposed on the working class, not their desires manifested. It seems to me that when Jerry says populism here, what he is specifically referring to is the most immediate and distasteful version of that to him. This is to say he's kind of just talking about Donald Trump again. There isn't necessarily a problem with that, but it becomes a problem when all of the nuance about what political populism and elitism really are and how they interact with culture is lost. Collapsing all of his circumstantial bugbears into a term like populism naturalizes this Trump versus establishment liberalism conflict as the conflict, the only one that's able to be discussed. In the end, this has blinkered his view such that he has identified populism rather than elitism as the problem. And this is an important tendency of Jerry's that I feel is reflected in the art world at large. With that in mind, I want to begin on the topic of deskilling. The practice of deskilling was described in 2004 by another art critic, Benjamin Buchloh, as the quote, persistent effort to eliminate artisanal competence and other forms of manual virtuosity from the horizon of both artistic production and aesthetic evaluation, unquote. Deskilling has been in some form present in the art world as far back as the 60s and arguably much longer, and it remains fixed in contemporary art today. There are two general styles in deskilled art, I would say roughly divided along the lines of abstraction and representation. Of course, there are plenty of artists who fall between these categories or exhibit only minor influences of deskilling, but I think it's helpful to outline what sort of art I'm referring to when I say deskilling. As well, I want to make clear that I do personally enjoy some of the work by the artists I'll be talking about, even though I'm generally negative towards deskilling as a practice. The point is not to pick on these artists, but to consider the way their work is presently contextualized and how it functions culturally. The first abstract-leaning set of deskilled artists were described by yet another art critic, Raphael Rubinstein, as making, quote, provisional paintings. In his words, these are, quote, artists who have long made works that look casual, dashed off, tentative, unfinished, or self-canceling. In different ways, they all deliberately turn away from, quote, strong, unquote, painting for something that seems to constantly risk inconsequence or collapse, unquote. Some of the painters Rubinstein highlights are Raoul de Keyser, Albert Olin, Christopher Wohl, and Michael Kraber. These are works that seem to pursue purposelessness. They are intentionally contradictory, unsophisticated at almost every level, thereby suggesting sophistication, like missing every answer on a true or false quiz. The other group, the representational artists, engage with something that I would call pseudo-folk art. These are artists who, despite their almost ubiquitous academic backgrounds, channel the aesthetics of genuine folk or outsider artists like Henry Darger, Martin Ramirez, Lee Godey, James Castle, and Aldo Fulfley. Those who were self-taught and spent their lives on the outside of the formal art world. Some contemporary artists I'd classify as pseudo-folk are Judah Kether, Catherine Bernhardt, Catherine Bradford, and Matthew Wong. As opposed to the provisional painters, these artists' works appear finished in a more conventional sense. However, their paintings often involve very simplified, symbol-like representations, an amateurish handling of the material, and often have a sort of sloppy decorative quality. Outsider art has been an explicit interest of and influence on art world insiders since the start of the 20th century. Whereas those earlier modernist movements, such as Expressionism, were influenced by folk art in the sense that it was thought to be more directly expressive and untrapped by the conventions of measured academic art, this contemporary pseudo-folk is about a sort of knowing and indulgent mock naivete. That isn't to say that all these artists aren't honest in their work. It's more that there's a provocative joy in doing things wrong on purpose. It's not a redefinition or even abolition of skill, but a purposeful unskill. This is where I'm starting to branch out from just describing deskilling and getting more into my own interpretation of it. I imagine there are plenty of people who would disagree with that assessment, and it all gets a bit tricky because skill has never been an entirely consistent concept in art. I would say, in fact, that one of the main projects of modernism was an expansive redefinition of artistic skill. Each successive movement in modernism sought to unbind art from whatever new academic vision of it had been created by the movement before. This sort of shifts to questioning of skill as a category altogether as we approach postmodernism. In the case of process-based works or conceptual artworks, there's an attempt to circumvent, if not outright remove, skill from the equation entirely. Deskilling, importantly, is not a redefinition or negation of skill as a category. Rather, deskilled art is actively and only oppositional, not necessarily towards the idea that skill exists, but whether skill, that is, technical skill with material, is important in art. As it happens, deskilling is a binding principle in Jerry Saltz's critical approach. In this quote, which is for what it's worth used to summarize Saltz's perspective on Wikipedia, he explains, quote, "All great contemporary artists, schooled or not, are essentially self-taught and are deskilling like crazy. I don't look for skill in art. Skill has nothing to do with technical proficiency. I'm interested in people who rethink skill, who redefine or reimagine it. An engineer, say, who builds rockets from rocks." Unquote. Saltz's position is basically that artistic skill in the traditional hegemonic sense is unimportant to evaluating art. And this idea about skill is fairly common across contemporary art. As Saltz said, lots and lots of artists have been deskilling like crazy. While the theoretical, artistic, and expressive merits of deskilling have been discussed at length, there's been a lot less focus on the particular functioning of deskilling and the framework which enables it. This is an issue because the practical functioning relies on harmful divisions specific to this social order. In practice, to communicate disinterest in evaluating art based on the skill involved in making it, one requires the existence of a hegemonic framework in the popular consciousness for what constitutes skill. An accepted version of artistic skill must still exist because the position of deskilling is purely oppositional. If that object of opposition is removed, the stance is meaningless. To my earlier point, this is why Saltz's naturalization of kitsch is significant. The initial divisions which Clement Greenberg observed between avant-garde and kitsch were formal. He noted the tendency of the avant-garde towards abstraction and claimed, controversially, that kitsch is academic and all that is academic is kitsch. Deskilling and the critical framework which promotes it de-emphasize the formal qualities of art, as we see with Jerry Saltz's neutral position on surface quality. The promise of deskilling is that high art can be opened to a wide range of approaches that do not share the same narrow and theoretical positions on style and form. Deskilling proposes a third position where questions of kitsch and avant-garde are neutralized. However, those formal divisions were only ever a byproduct of the social order which creates an avant-garde kitsch dichotomy. The divide is not generated by base preference for certain material qualities, but rather by the social systems of capitalism. So a form of cultural division along the same lines is going to be perpetuated. However, this division is now further obscured because it relies less on the definite and discernible qualities of the art and exists more as an apparently subjective perspective. It allows for a person positioned within the avant-garde to appreciate kitsch forms for avant-garde reasons. Increasingly, instead of works and their formal qualities representing this split, our individual responses and persons are coded as such. Greenberg advocated for the avant-garde on the basis of it protecting the practice of art for its own sake in a burgeoning global capitalism that was otherwise hostile to such a thing. In contrast, deskilling is a practice which takes for granted the avant-garde. Deskilling requires another cultural mode, specifically an accepted version of skill, to define itself against. Because of this, it is a definitionally elitist practice and unable to achieve the resolution of high and low art in their current forms. In its application, deskilling only serves to reinforce the avant-garde kitsch dichotomy by treating it as a natural state rather than an imposition of capitalism. Because this framework requires a hegemonic notion of skill and the accepted line is not caring about skill at all, artwork which conforms to standards of skill, as well as that which defies them, must have a presence in this de-skilled version of the avant-garde. In fact, there exists in contemporary art a radical skill fetishism, an art whose primary concern is excelling within hegemonic standards of skill, and especially with appearing concerned with skill. This can be observed in the works of artists like V.S. Salmons, who practices a sort of realism defined by extreme precision and intricacy. Or in artists like John Curran and Vincent Desiderio, who specifically recall so-called old master techniques. Notably, the artists I've mentioned do participate in the same avant-garde as de-skilled artists on the basis of maintaining this institutional, skill-neutral position and not preferring de-skilled art, which would risk an actual redefinition or abolition of skill. Though the skill is obviously key to the work these artists are making, that must sometimes be denied in asserting oneself in the avant-garde. We can see this operating in practice when Jerry Saltz claims to enjoy the hyper-skilled work of John Curran for reasons other than the skill. Quote, John Curran is always lauded for his skill. Curran is a capable painter. What makes his paintings interesting, however, is not his skill, but the high level of specificity in his work, his ability to engage wide audiences, and the original way he uses photographic sources while shunning photographic space. Unquote. Certainly there's more to Curran's work than just skill, but to deny that his technical mastery is not at least part of what makes his paintings interesting is suspicious to me. Curran is very evidently recalling high Renaissance painting, which means a particular definite version of artistic skill. More than that, two of the three ideas which Saltz finds more interesting than the skill in Curran's work are, in fact, direct byproducts of his skillful technique. The quote high level of specificity is absolutely related to the fine rendering and detail of Curran's work. As well, his paintings would seem to shun photographic space because his technique is borrowed from a pre-photographic tradition of painting. These are not so much pursuits in their own right as they are effects of Curran's dedication to a certain standard of skillful painting. In practice, Saltz and the de-skilling crowd at large are made to reinstate the cultural stratification of avant-garde and kitsch through interpretive rather than formal means. The dichotomy persists, but as a cultural affect, increasingly detached from material distinction. Deskilling is the theory and practice of an art world born inside the avant-garde. Unlike Greenberg and his contemporaries, the artists and theorists who have reified deskilling did not experience the initial emergence of avant-garde and kitsch, and thus were less aware of their positions inside of it. Deskilling could only occur if this was assumed as a natural state. In a more direct sense as well, it has to do with the reaming of art for profit. Deskilling is part of a larger turn away from the personal skill of artists. It is the destruction of categories and expectations of the craft, skill and, to be cheesy, soul that is invested in art and enriched by it. It isn't a bad instinct to want a looser definition of skill or art in general, but on the terms of deskilling, this only makes art more susceptible. We're merely accelerating the subjugation of art to capital, both obscuring its influence and reinstating its will at the base level. I feel strongly that deskilling as it exists is misguided, but there's a reason why the practice is appealing to so many people who do care deeply about art. To start, I'll defer to Jean Dubuffet, who wonderfully explained the appeal of unskilled and outsider art back in the mid-20th century. Quote, those works created from solitude and from pure and authentic creative impulses, where the worries of competition, acclaim, and social promotion do not interfere, are, because of these very facts, more precious than the productions of professionals. After a certain familiarity with these flourishings of an exalted feverishness, lived so fully and so intensely by their authors, we cannot avoid the feeling that in relation to these works, cultural art in its entirety appears to be the game of a feudal society, a fallacious parade." Unquote. Dubuffet observed that unskilled art was attractive in large part because it was free of the pressures of competition which traditionally pervade the avant-garde. By keenly identifying the value of outsider art, Dubuffet also underlines how backwards the practice of deskilling is. It is not because the works are technically limited that outsider art is less compromised, it's because these artists make work outside of the capitalist art world and the craven cannibalistic impulses which sustain it. When artists already inculcated with market incentives adopt these aesthetics, they're merely buying credibility through a surface-level association with art that has not yet been fully rendered by capital. The fundamental beauty of unskilled art is nothing inherent to style or aesthetics. It's the spirit of creation expressed by one who didn't pestle themselves getting a spot in the Whitney Biennial.